Lillian Thomas had spent 30 years building a life with her husband, Gerald, only to uncover a betrayal so deep it shattered everything she thought she knew. What started as a quiet suspicion soon erupted into a web of lies, deceit, and a secret affair with their neighbor that would change the course of their lives forever. As Gerald's world began to crumble under the weight of his own lies, Lillian was left with one burning question. How far was she willing to go to reclaim her life and her power? Lillian Cavanaugh had spent the last 30 years believing she had built the perfect life. From the moment she met Gerald, she had envisioned a future filled with love, trust, and stability. Their marriage had been the kind that others admired, a partnership that withstood the test of time. Together, they had raised 2 children, now grown and living successful lives of their own. They had a beautiful home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names and waved from their porches. It was a picture-perfect existence, or so she thought. For years, Lillian had prided herself on the strength of her marriage. She and Gerald had been through everything together. They weathered financial struggles when they were young, supported each other through career changes, and celebrated milestones as a team. Gerald had always been dependable, a man of routine who rarely deviated from his schedule. He left for work at the same time every morning, came home at the same time every evening, and spent weekends tending to the yard or working on small home improvement projects. To Lillian, that consistency was comforting. Their neighborhood was a close-knit one, filled with families who had lived there for decades. It was the kind of place where people brought casseroles to new residents and looked out for each other's homes when someone went on vacation. Among those neighbors was Vivian Holloway, a widow who had lived next door for nearly as long as the Cavanaughs had. She was a quiet woman, never one to cause trouble or seek attention. She kept her home immaculate, her garden always in bloom, and though she attended neighborhood events, she never seemed to form close bonds with anyone. Lillian had never given Vivian much thought. She was polite when they crossed paths, exchanging small talk about the weather or the latest neighborhood gossip, but there was never anything beyond that. Yet, in recent years, something about Vivian had started to make Lillian feel uneasy. It wasn't anything obvious, just small things that didn't sit right. She often wondered why she felt an unspoken tension when Vivian was around, why there were fleeting moments where Gerald seemed strangely distracted when Vivian entered a room. But she always dismissed those thoughts as irrational. Their marriage, after all, was solid. At least, that's what she told herself. As their children grew older and moved out, life became quieter. Lillian and Gerald settled into their roles as an aging couple, comfortable in their routines. Even after Gerald retired, he remained structured in his habits. He still woke up early, went on morning walks, and spent his afternoons reading in his study. In the evenings, they would watch television together, have quiet dinners, and talk about mundane things, grocery lists, upcoming family visits, the latest news. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But then, little things began to shift. At first, it was subtle. Gerald taking longer walks than usual, spending more time in his study, and growing increasingly protective of his phone. He had never been the type to use technology excessively, but suddenly, he always seemed to have his phone nearby, checking messages more often than before. Lillian noticed, but chose not to question it. She didn't want to be the kind of wife who pried into her husband's personal matters. Then there were the nights she woke up to find his side of the bed empty. The first time it happened, she assumed he had trouble sleeping and had gone to the living room to read. But as the nights it occurred became more frequent, she began to wonder. Each time she asked, Gerald gave a simple explanation. Insomnia, restlessness, an aching back that made him prefer the couch. She accepted those answers, though something in her gut told her there was more to the story. One afternoon, while cleaning the house, she came across a crumpled piece of paper in the pocket of one of Gerald's jackets. It was a receipt from an upscale boutique, dated just a few weeks before their anniversary. At first, she felt a flutter of excitement. Had he bought her a special gift? But when their anniversary came and went without any mention of it, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. She tucked the receipt away, unsure of what to do with it. The unease continued to grow, fed by whispers she overheard at a neighborhood gathering. A group of women were talking about Vivian, speculating about a mysterious visitor who had been seen at her house late at night. Lillian felt a strange tightening in her chest. She didn't want to let her imagination run wild, but the pieces were slowly beginning to form a picture she didn't want to see. For the first time in her marriage, she felt the foundation beneath her cracking. She had always believed that if something was wrong, she would know. She had convinced herself that she and Gerald were immune to the kinds of betrayals that plagued other marriages. But now, doubt had seeped into her thoughts, and no matter how much she tried to push it away, it refused to leave. The more she watched Gerald, the more suspicious she became. His behavior, once predictable and steady, now seemed secretive. He avoided eye contact when she asked about his day. He left the house at odd hours without explanation. He became strangely defensive over the most trivial things, snapping at her when she asked innocent questions. One evening, as she sat alone at the dining table, staring at the untouched plate of food in front of her, she realized she could no longer ignore what was happening. She had spent 30 years building a life with Gerald, believing in their love, trusting in their commitment. But now, for the first time, she wondered if she had been living a lie. As the weight of her suspicions pressed down on her, she made a silent vow. She would find out the truth. No matter how painful, no matter what it revealed, she would uncover what had been hidden from her for far too long. Lillian's mind became consumed with doubts that refused to fade. She tried to suppress them, convincing herself that she was overthinking, that after 3 decades of marriage, it was impossible for Gerald to betray her. But the more she observed him, the more certain she became that something was terribly wrong. The late-night disappearances continued, growing more frequent as time went on. At first, Lillian told herself that Gerald was simply struggling with sleep, but it no longer made sense. She would wake up in the middle of the night and listen, hoping to hear him shifting on the couch or making tea in the kitchen. But there was only silence. Each time she got out of bed to check, she found the living room empty, his shoes missing from their usual spot by the door. The first few times she told herself he had stepped outside for fresh air. But how long could someone need to breathe? She started paying closer attention to his movements during the day. He had always been a man of habit, predictable in the way he moved through life. But now his routines were shifting, becoming erratic. He spent more time in his study with the door closed, claiming he was reading or organizing old paperwork. His phone, once casually left on the coffee table or kitchen counter, was now always in his pocket or face down beside him, the screen lighting up only when he was sure she wasn't looking. Lillian fought the urge to snoop, to pick up the phone when he wasn't around and see what secrets it held. She had never been the kind of wife who needed to invade her husband's privacy. But this wasn't about trust anymore. This was about knowing whether the man she had spent 3 decades with was the same man she thought he was. One afternoon, while doing laundry, she found something that made her stomach twist. In the pocket of one of Gerald's jackets, she discovered another receipt, this one from a hotel in the next town over. The date on it was recent, less than a month old. It wasn't a business trip. Gerald had been retired for years. There was no reason for him to be at a hotel. A sinking feeling settled in her chest, heavier than before. She knew she had to be sure. She couldn't jump to conclusions without evidence, no matter how much her instincts screamed at her. That night, instead of confronting him outright, she watched him more closely. She noticed how his eyes darted away when she spoke about their future plans. She paid attention to how quickly he ended phone calls when she entered the room, and, most importantly, she noticed the way he avoided touching her. Their intimacy had faded over the years, something she had always attributed to aging, to the natural course of a long marriage. But now, she wondered if there was another reason. The thought of Gerald touching someone else made her sick, but she needed to know the truth. The turning point came when she overheard the neighbors talking. She had never been one for gossip, but on this particular day, as she was tending to the garden, A group of women were chatting just a few feet away, their voices hushed yet eager. They spoke about Vivian Holloway, how she had been receiving secret visits from a man late at night, how they had seen someone sneaking around her backyard, slipping in and out of her home. Lillian felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Her breath caught in her throat, and she gripped the garden tool in her hand, her knuckles turning white. It wasn't possible. Not Vivian. Not their neighbor. The woman who had lived beside them for decades. The woman who had smiled at her during neighborhood events, who had waved from across the driveway like everything was normal. Her hands shook as she put away her gardening tools and went inside, but she refused to break down. If her suspicions were right, if Gerald had been sneaking into Vivian's house in the middle of the night, then she needed to see it for herself. No accusations, no desperate pleas for the truth, just proof. That night, she waited. She pretended to fall asleep, her breathing steady, her body still. Hours passed, and just when she began to wonder if she had been wrong, she heard it. The quiet creak of the floorboards, the soft shuffle of feet moving toward the door. Her heart pounded as she listened to Gerald slip out of the house, his movements careful, calculated. Lillian forced herself to wait, giving him time to reach wherever he was going. Then, slowly, she got out of bed and moved to the window. She peered through the curtains just in time to see him disappear into Vivian's backyard. The sight nearly knocked the air from her lungs. She stood frozen, her mind screaming at her to do something, to storm over and catch him in the act. But she couldn't move. Instead, she felt herself sinking into a cold, quiet rage. It was one thing to suspect, another to hear rumors, but now she had seen it with her own eyes. Unable to stay still, she grabbed a coat and stepped outside, staying hidden in the shadows as she made her way toward Vivian's house. She could feel her heart pounding in her ears, her breath shallow and uneven. Every step felt heavier than the last. When she reached the side of the house, she crouched near a window, just low enough to remain unseen. Carefully, she peered through the small opening between the curtains, and what she saw made her stomach churn. Inside, Gerald and Vivian sat close together, their hands intertwined. The way he looked at her, the way he leaned in as she laughed. It was a level of intimacy Lillian hadn't seen from him in years. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box, setting it in Vivian's palm with a gentle smile. She unwrapped it slowly, her face lighting up as she held the delicate gold bracelet inside. Lillian knew then that this was no fleeting affair. This was something that had been going on for a long time, maybe even decades. It explained everything. The late nights, the guarded phone, the missing time. This wasn't a mistake. This was a betrayal so deep that it had shattered the very foundation of their marriage. Tears burned at the edges of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not let this break her. Not yet. She turned away from the window and made her way back home, each step heavier than the last. She felt like a ghost moving through her own life. Every memory with Gerald now tainted. Every moment of trust, now a lie. By the time she reached her bedroom, she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end. She wasn't going to confront him in a fit of rage, wasn't going to beg him for the truth. No, she was going to find out just how deep this deception ran. And when the time was right, she would make sure Gerald Kavanaugh paid for every single year he had stolen from her. Lillian lay awake long after Gerald returned home. She heard the soft creak of the front door as he slipped inside, moving cautiously as if afraid to wake her. He didn't know she had followed him. He didn't know she had seen him with Vivian, laughing, holding her hand, giving her a gift like a devoted lover. The betrayal settled deep in her bones, suffocating and inescapable. She remained still, pretending to be asleep as he climbed into bed beside her. His breathing was steady, unbothered, as if nothing had happened. The weight of his deception pressed against her, and she clenched her fists beneath the covers. The man she had trusted for 30 years, the man she had built a life with, had been living a secret life right under her nose. And the worst part was that he didn't even feel guilty enough to hide it properly. Morning arrived, and Lillian forced herself into routine. She made breakfast as she always did, setting the table, pouring coffee, acting like nothing had changed. Gerald sat across from her, reading the newspaper, sipping his drink. He didn't notice the way her hands trembled slightly as she stirred her tea, nor did he see the way her eyes burned with quiet fury when she looked at him. She wanted to scream. She wanted to throw the steaming cup in his face and demand to know how long this had been going on. But she wouldn't. Not yet. Instead, she would wait. She needed to know everything. How long? Why? How deeply he was entangled in this affair. She wouldn't act until she had complete control over the situation. Over the next few days, she became an investigator in her own home. She watched him closely, noting every small inconsistency. Every time he checked his phone, every unnecessary errand he suddenly had to run. And then, when he wasn't looking, she searched. His study was the first place she went. It had always been his private space, filled with books and old papers, a room she never had much reason to enter. But now, she moved through it with purpose, opening drawers, rifling through stacks of documents, searching for anything that might confirm the depth of his betrayal. She found receipts, more than just the hotel ones she had already seen, dinner reservations at restaurants he had never taken her to, jewelry store purchases that had never found their way into her hands. And then, buried beneath old bank statements, she found something that made her blood run cold. A second set of keys. She turned them over in her palm, her mind racing. They weren't house keys. They were too different, too unfamiliar. And then the truth hit her like a train. Vivian's house. They had been together long enough for him to have a key to her home. He didn't just visit her in secret. He had access. Lillian sat in the study for a long time, staring at the keys. The weight of 30 years of marriage pressed down on her, crushing, suffocating. How long had she been a fool? How many times had she looked into Gerald's eyes and believed his lies? She couldn't ignore it anymore. She needed to go further. That night, while Gerald slept, she took his phone. Her heart pounded as she navigated the security settings. If he had changed his password, she wasn't sure what she would do. But, to her surprise, it was the same as always. He hadn't even bothered to protect his secrets. She scrolled through his messages, her hands shaking. There they were, text after text from Vivian. She read them in silence, feeling her stomach twist with every affectionate word, every memory they shared. He spoke to Vivian with a tenderness that had been missing from their own marriage for years. He told her she was beautiful, that he had never been happier, that one day they wouldn't have to hide anymore. The final blow came when she found the email. It was from Gerald to a real estate agent, inquiring about a house. Not for them, for him and Vivian. He was planning a future with her, a life outside of the one he had built with Lillian. Rage swelled inside her, thick and consuming. He wasn't just having an affair. He was planning to leave, to abandon the life they had built together, to discard her like an old memory, and start fresh with someone else. She placed the phone back exactly where she had found it and returned to bed. But she didn't sleep. The anger inside her had grown into something dark, something unstoppable. Gerald had spent years lying, betraying, sneaking behind her back, and now he thought he could erase her, move on without consequences. The next day, she continued as if nothing had changed. But something inside her had snapped. The knowledge of his plans fueled her, made her sharper, more calculated. She began, digging deeper, finding every piece of evidence she could, preparing for the moment she would strike. She checked their financial records. Their shared accounts hadn't been touched, but Gerald had a separate account she had never known about, one that had been slowly accumulating money over the years. He had been planning this for a long time, ensuring he had enough to leave without looking back. The betrayal felt endless. Every day, she uncovered more lies, more secrets. And each time, it solidified what she already knew. Gerald Kavanaugh had never truly loved her. At least, not enough. Not enough to stay. Not enough to be honest. Not enough to keep the vows he had made 3 decades ago. One evening, Lillian sat alone in the kitchen, staring at a blank piece of paper. It was time to make a decision. She could confront him now, throw the truth in his face, demand an explanation that would only leave her more broken than she already was. Or she could wait. But waiting wasn't enough. She didn't just want the truth. She wanted justice. She wanted him to feel the same helplessness, the same devastation that he had forced upon her. She wanted him to lose everything, just as she was about to. She started formulating a plan, quiet, deliberate, devastating. She wasn't going to beg him to stay, nor was she going to let him walk away unscathed. No. When the time came, she would make sure that Gerald Kavanaugh regretted every moment of his betrayal. For the next week, she continued as though nothing had changed. She smiled when he spoke, laughed at his stories, kissed him goodnight. She played the role of the devoted wife one last time. But deep inside, she was already gone. She watched him carefully, noting the days he left the house, the times he slipped into Vivian's home. She waited until she knew his patterns, until she was certain of when he would be gone for hours at a time. And then, one evening, when the house was empty, she took the spare set of keys from his study and left. She crossed the yard, her hands steady, her mind calm. She inserted the key into Vivian's front door and stepped inside. She wasn't sure what she would find, but she knew one thing for certain. By the time she walked out, nothing would ever be the same again. Lillian stood in the dimly lit entryway of Vivian's house, her breath slow and controlled. The air carried a faint floral scent, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions raging inside her. She had crossed the threshold into the life her husband had been living in secret, a world she had been blind to for far too long. The walls held the echoes of laughter and whispered confessions, stolen moments between Gerald and the woman who had taken everything from her. She moved through the house, carefully, her fingers trailing along the furniture, the framed pictures on the walls. Some were of Vivian alone, but others were more damning. Photos of Gerald and Vivian together, standing close, their smiles filled with an intimacy that Lillian hadn't seen from her husband in years. He had built an entire life within these walls, one she had never been meant to discover. She stepped into the living room and saw the evidence of their affair laid out before her. A jacket she recognized as Gerald's draped over the couch, a book on the coffee table with his reading glasses resting on top of it, a bottle of his favorite whiskey on the bar cart, half empty. He had been comfortable here, too comfortable. This was more than an affair. It was a second home. Her gaze landed on a small gift box sitting on the side table. She hesitated before picking it up, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside was an elegant diamond bracelet, far more expensive than anything he had ever given her in recent years. A card lay beneath it, with Gerald's handwriting staring back at her. She forced herself to read the words, each one slicing through her like a blade. For my love, the one who makes me feel alive again. Soon, we'll have everything we've dreamed of. Her hands clenched the note, crumpling it as a surge of rage overtook her. He had spoken of dreams, of a future, as if she had been nothing more than an afterthought, a discarded chapter in his life story. Every memory of their 30 years together felt like a cruel joke, a carefully constructed lie that he had maintained while building something real with someone else. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Anger alone wouldn't be enough. She needed more than just proof of his infidelity. She needed to dismantle everything he had built in secret. She pulled out her phone and began capturing pictures of the house, the framed photos, the note, the gifts. Every piece of evidence would be useful. She wasn't just going to confront him, she was going to destroy him, Her mind raced with possibilities. She could expose him in the most public way, ensure that everyone in their lives knew exactly what kind of man he was. She could drain their shared accounts before he had the chance to leave with his hidden savings. She could turn his carefully planned future into a nightmare. A sound from outside made her freeze. Tires rolling over gravel, headlights flashed through the window, illuminating the living room for a brief second before disappearing. Panic surged through her veins as she realized what was happening. Gerald was here. Lillian reacted quickly, stepping back into the shadows of the hallway. She pressed herself against the wall as she heard the front door unlock. Footsteps echoed through the entryway, followed by the unmistakable sound of his voice. He was talking to someone. Vivian. Lillian's mind raced. She had expected to find more evidence, maybe even to destroy some of his things in a moment of blind fury. But she hadn't planned for this. She hadn't prepared to be trapped inside the house while the two of them walked in, oblivious to her presence. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as they moved further inside, laughing softly, speaking in hushed voices. She didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe too loudly. If they found her here, if they realized she had uncovered everything, she didn't know what she would do. She listened carefully, piecing together their conversation. They were talking about the house. Gerald was telling Vivian that everything was almost ready, that soon he would tell Lillian the truth and finally be free. The audacity of his words made her grip her phone tighter. He spoke as if he were the victim, as if he had been trapped in a marriage he no longer wanted, instead of being the one who had lied and manipulated for years. Vivian sighed, her voice filled with concern. She asked him if he was sure, if he had a plan to handle Lillian. Gerald reassured her, saying that Lillian was predictable, that she would be hurt but would accept the truth and move on. He spoke as if Lillian were a fragile, clueless woman who wouldn't fight back. The words sent a chill through her. He didn't just want to leave, he wanted to leave on his own terms, in control of the situation, without consequence. He had no idea that she had already slipped out from under his control. Lillian swallowed down her rage and waited. She needed an opportunity to escape before they saw her. Moving quickly and quietly, she crept through the hallway, keeping to the edges where the floorboards wouldn't creak. The kitchen door was her best option. If she could slip out before they noticed, she could make it back home undetected. But as she reached the door, she miscalculated. Her foot knocked into the leg of a chair, sending it scraping against the tile. The noise shattered the silence. She froze, heart hammering, as she heard Gerald's voice call out. He was coming closer. Lillian made a split-second decision. She grabbed the nearest object, a small vase from the counter, and hurled it toward the back of the house. It crashed loudly, sending shards scattering across the floor. The distraction worked. Gerald and Vivian rushed toward the noise, giving Lillian the opening she needed. She threw the kitchen door open and bolted outside, her feet hitting the pavement as she sprinted away. She didn't stop running until she reached her house. Only when she was safely inside, the door locked behind her, did she allow herself to breathe. She leaned against the wall, her pulse still racing. Her hands shook, but she wasn't afraid. No, she was exhilarated. She had just seen the true depths of Gerald's betrayal, and now she had something he didn't expect, the upper hand. Her mind was already working, putting the final pieces together. Gerald thought he could control the outcome. He thought he could leave her behind and walk away unscathed. He was wrong. Lillian wasn't going to let him leave on his own terms. She was going to take everything from him first. Lillian sat in the dim glow of her bedroom, her mind racing through the events of the last few hours. The weight of everything she had discovered pressed down on her, but instead of breaking under it, she felt herself sharpening. The hurt was still there, an ache deep in her chest, but it no longer consumed her. It had transformed into something else. Determination. Gerald had built his web of lies over decades, confident that he would never be caught, believing that she was too blind, too trusting to ever see the truth, but he had underestimated her. She picked up her phone and scrolled through the pictures she had taken inside Vivian's house. Every image was a piece of evidence, a brick in the foundation of her revenge. She had spent 30 years as the perfect wife, the supportive partner, the woman who had sacrificed her own dreams to help build Gerald's success. And now, he was planning to discard her like an afterthought. But she wasn't going to let him walk away with everything he had built on her sacrifices. She had already made the first move. Hours earlier, she had transferred money from their joint accounts into one of her own. Gerald might have been hiding assets, but he had made the mistake of assuming she hadn't been paying attention. Over the years, she had quietly taken note of every financial decision, every investment, every hidden account he had thought she wouldn't notice. Tonight, she had made sure to take what was rightfully hers. Her next step was even more brutal. She opened her email and began attaching the pictures of Gerald and Vivian's affair. She didn't just send them to him, she sent them to his colleagues, his clients, and even to the members of their social circle who still saw them as the perfect couple. She wanted him to feel the humiliation, the destruction of his reputation, just as she had felt the betrayal. As she hit send, a strange calm settled over her. This was no longer about heartbreak. This was about justice. She spent the next few hours preparing. She packed a bag, placing inside only the things that mattered, her important documents, valuables, and enough money to last her for a while. She wasn't going to sit and wait for Gerald to return, to spin his lies and excuses. She had no interest in hearing him beg or explain. He had lost that right the moment he chose to betray her. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway made her heart quicken, but not with fear. She knew exactly what was coming. She stood by the window and watched as Gerald stepped out of his car, moving quickly toward the house. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his movements. He had seen the emails. He knew that his world was crumbling. She stepped back, allowing him to burst through the front door. He called her name, his voice a mixture of anger and desperation. She could hear the panic in his tone, the realization that he had lost control. He stormed through the house, searching for her, but she remained hidden in the shadows, watching. She let him yell, let him pace, let him unravel. Then, just as he reached for his phone to call her, she stepped into the light. He froze, their eyes locking across the room. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The look in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. Gerald tried to speak, tried to piece together an excuse, but she held up a single finger, silencing him. Then, without another glance, she turned and walked past him, her bag in hand. She left him standing there, drowning in the wreckage of his own making. As she stepped outside, the cold night air hit her, but she didn't shiver. She felt lighter, freer than she had in years. Gerald had spent 3 decades building a lie, believing that she would never see the truth. But the truth had finally come for him. And Lillian had made sure that it destroyed him.